So here we go. First of all, so pen picture. So I'm Nick Wilkins. I'm trained to be a teacher. Became a secondary science and maths teacher. Did that for about 7 years. Went to work in the West Indies for a bit, which was great. Came back. I was a teacher in what at the time was a borstal, so now we would call that a young offenders institution. Then I worked in the independent sector for a bit. Then I became an advisory head teacher in one of the inner London boroughs. I'll talk to you more about that in a little bit. And what we did there, and at the moment, so I'm obviously a tutor at TLI, and I'm the course leader for the foundation degree in mental health and wellbeing of children and young people. And I'm also the co-course tutor, course leader for the University of Newman Birmingham's MA in Values-Led Leadership. So all, interesting stuff really around how to treat people and values that we should have. So I'm going to talk about this, and it's impossible really to talk about optimism without talking about its unpleasant friend pessimism. So I'm going to bring him in occasionally, and I will also talk about some words that are rather difficult, like resilience, because it's also really not possible to talk about optimism without talking about resilience. And so you may want to talk later about what we think resilience means. I'm just going to say at this point that I do not think, absolutely do not think it is a quality of people. And I'm going to say I think it's a label that we apply to people to describe effects that actually they've not come up with themselves, but that they've had done to them. So we may want to talk about later, I'm not sure. Anyway, when I went to this inner London borough, there are 142 local authorities in the UK, and we just had an Ofsted inspection, and we were 142nd out of 142. And the then director of education was sacked, and the new one came in and said, look, what are we going to do about this? Because we've got 104 schools, and we've got so many of them in special measures, and everything's really depressing, blah, blah. And he said to us, we need to do something. Go away, think about something, come back. We want to do it in the schools so that we're not 142nd out of 142, because it's not great. And I had found this thing that was on the screen at the moment, which probably you've all seen, I guess. It's Zubin and Spring's stress vulnerability model. And it bugged me for a long time, because Zubin and Spring did this kind of bit of maths, and by this complex maths, they were able to draw this thing called a threshold. So what they did was they said, look, everybody's vulnerable to some extent. I mean, children and young people are all vulnerable because they depend on us. They can't be vulnerable. They're all vulnerable. But some of them are a little bit vulnerable, like the chap in the yellow, and some of them are a lot vulnerable, like the chap in the blue. And there's a thing called stress. And, stress goes up and down, doesn't it? In the morning, I'm not all that stressed. In the afternoon, I'm very stressed. All my life is very stressful. But what interested me was this idea that some people can actually be very vulnerable and not be able to deal with very much stress. And even with a small amount of stress, they can tip over that threshold. And because Zubin and Spring were health researchers, they use those words wellness and illness, and I've kept them because I think they're quite useful, really. So they said, look, if you're the yellow person, you can have an awful lot of stress, but because you're not very vulnerable, you can deal with the stress. You don't tip over into illness. Whereas if you're the blue person, you don't actually need very much to happen to you before you tipped over the threshold and you become unwell. So I was quite interested in why it was that some people were able to deal with a lot of stress and other people were not. And that got me and the team that were working on this thinking about optimism and the other word, which is pessimism. So now you're not going to find this in the book. This is me talking. So, bear in mind that it may be completely wrong, or you may just totally disagree with it, which is, fine, good, in fact. I think that optimism or pessimism is an indicator of the damage that's been done to us. or at least I think it's an indicator of the degree to which we can manage the damage which has been done to us. So if we're lucky and we've not had much damage, I think we can, it's quite easy to be optimistic. I think if we've had a lot of damage and we don't know how to manage it, it's pretty difficult to be optimistic, and we're probably going to be pessimistic about life in general. But we can maybe learn to manage that damage. I've put resilience there in brackets for the reasons that I've already said, because you could interchange these words often. But resilience, as I say, I think is a special animal and outside of the scope today. Optimism is an indicator, I think, of hope. I think if I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful. I think if I'm pessimistic, I'm probably hopeless. And if you know Weiner's work on attribution theory, you probably can see that actually this is also about locus of control. So if I believe that I have got control over events in my life, I'm in charge of my life, I can make decisions and make things happen. If I've got an internal locus of control, I think it's a lot easier to be optimistic. I think if my locus of control is external, if I think other people are controlling me, or just, events, I park on the yellow line outside a newsagent, I pop in to get a newspaper, I come out, and the parking warden's writing me a ticket, and I say, why does this, or if anything's going to happen, if anything bad's going to happen, it's going to happen. I'm just that kind of a person. Anything bad's going around, it comes to me. It wouldn't come to you. Oh no, you get away with everything. But me, all I've got to do is step an inch over a line and, boom. That's what I'm like. That's my life. That's having an external locus of control. I think it's being pessimistic. I don't generally read slides, but I'm going to read this one because I think it's easy to read the words and not actually take them in. So Seligman, who we'll meet in a later slide, who wrote the book Learned Optimism and Learned Helplessness, he's done research on this. So this is not kind of, wishful thinking. We know that this is the case. What happens to optimists? We know that they learn more. They get better grades. They have better relationships. They're more effective at work. They have more friends than pessimists. They enjoy life more. They get better jobs. They get paid more. They get sick less often. When they are sick, they recover more quickly and they live longer. On average, Seligman says, optimists live about 8 years longer than pessimists. So where does our optimism come from? So this is a diagram of Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, or the bioecological systems theory as it's often called. It comes from our experienced environment. So there's me in the middle as the individual. And I'm just going to jump out a few layers. And there's a thing out there called the macro system. And in the macro system, it's stuff like policies. It's stuff like laws. It's stuff like the movement of money from one place to another in order to promote various kinds of programs by the government, probably, or by local authorities, or by councils, or by whoever. And look, I've just put a picture of an elephant on there, because hopefully I'll get to the end of the slide set, and then we can talk briefly about what I think is the elephant in the room here, because I've been listening with great interest to all of the speakers this morning, and it's been great. I think it's really opened my eyes to some things. It's really a few things that have been sort of actually made me quite cross, and I thought that's just not the case at all. But that's all great and part of the fun of coming to an event like this. But there's something which I don't think anybody talked about, which I think is the elephant in the room here, and that is, I think everybody's been pretty much, maybe with the exception of Anne Ferguson, I'm not sure, I think everybody pretty much has been talking about what we can do to support people who have suffered trauma, who are living their lives as a result of the impacts of that trauma and what have you. And we have to do that. That's valuable, it's essential, and probably most of us in this virtual space, most of our work is in supporting children and young people either directly or indirectly to help them to better manage their lives, to be better regulated or whatever, so that they maybe do less damage to themselves or to other people, so they enjoy life more, so there's something positive in it. The elephant in the room, it seems to me, is I don't think anybody has really been saying, well, okay, we have to do that work. We have to put those sticking plasters on people's cuts and grazes. We do have to do that. But isn't the big question, why are all these cuts? Why are all these people cut in the first place? What exactly are we doing to these people? Because I don't think the question is what's happened to you. I think the question is what's been done to you. And I think that the thing that does it is society, if you like. It's governments, it's local authorities, it's bodies that have the ability to deploy monies and practices and what have you. And I think really that's what we should be talking about. So we've got to do the other stuff. It's essential, it's critical, but I think there's a much bigger question that needs to be asked. And I always say to my students, watch out for what's going on in the macro system, which we may feel we don't have any control over, because what happens in the macro system, we scrap all the benefits and we replace them with universal credit. That happened out in the macro system, and it saved government £350 million or something. Yeah, it did, and it also meant that people who were already on benefits, on average, lost £20 a week. And those people were already the people who were finding it most difficult to manage financially, for example. So I often say to my students, watch out for stuff that's happening in the macro system, because sooner or later it's going to come down and hit us as individuals. What goes on in the macro system determines, I think, to a very great degree, our wellness or illness. So, look, leave aside the definition of the word resilience. Let's assume that we know what it means, and let's assume that it's not a quality of people, perhaps, but a label that we apply to people. Optimism is important because it's a determinant of resilience. Seligman, by the way, that's him in that picture. He says pessimism is marked by these 3 Ps. He says when we're pessimistic, we believe that negative stuff that happens, and negative stuff happens to all of us every day, doesn't it? But he says if we're actually basically pessimistic as people, we tend to believe that when that stuff happens, it's personal. It's not just negative stuff that happens full stop. It's negative stuff that finds its way to me. Pessimists believe stuff that happens to them negatively is about them. They believe that the negative stuff that happens is pervasive. So it's not just going to influence their schooling, it's also going to influence their relationships, it's going to influence their financial, it's going to influence everything, it's going to pervade every aspect of their life. And the 3rd P, they believe, he says, that not only is it about me, and not only is it about every aspect of my life, but it's permanent. This is going to be what my life is always. You know what, when people talk to us, or when we listen to people talking, actually the way that they speak, which is called their explanatory style, tells us if they're optimistic or pessimistic. Here's a couple of kind of light-hearted slides, because this can get a bit depressing, but it will get better at the end. Here's a couple of kind of light-hearted slides. They're both from sport. So here's Sergei Stakhovsky. He was ranked 116, went to Wimbledon, and he beat Roger Federer at Wimbledon. And in the post-match press conference, this is what he said. So this is a guy who's really good at tennis, presumably was earning a good living from it. And yet, actually, do you see what he was saying? He was saying, that was the game of my life, for sure. It was magic, magic. Do you see what he was saying? That won't happen again. I was lucky. He wasn't saying, I watched Roger's videos, and my coach and I discovered that actually, for the last couple of weeks, he hasn't been very great on the backhand. So I thought I'd put a lot of pressure on his backhand, and you know what, it's really paid off. And in the next round, I've got so-and-so, and we'll be looking at him as well. He didn't say that. He said, I've had the game of my life. It was magic. It's not going to happen again. He's a pessimist. Here's Alex Ferguson. If you're a football fan, you know how important this was. Spurs went up to Man United and beat them at Man United for the first time in 23 years. The Man United team that day, by all accounts and by all the reports, played dreadfully. Like every one of their players had a really bad game on the same day. Ferguson did not, in the post-match conference, say, the players have really let me down. The goalkeeper was appalling. He let in a soft goal. The centre backs were out of position. The strikers got nowhere near. He didn't say any of that. What he said was he really protected his team. Because effectively, you know what he's saying there? We had the worst day possible, and it's not going to happen again. And it didn't. Actually, they went on to win the league. So when people talk to us, actually, they tell us if they're optimists or pessimists. So here's the great thing about optimism. It's learnable, and we can develop it for ourselves by talking like an optimist. I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. And by challenging our own faulty thinking, those 3 Ps. It's personal, it's pervasive, and it's permanent. And this is why I've underlined this bit, because in this virtual space that we're in, where all of us working with children, young people, or adults, or whatever, we can turn ourselves into optimists if we want to, or we can make sure that we remain optimists. We can do this in ourselves, but also, and this is why it's critical, it's nice to be optimistic, but this is why it's critical for us, I think, in this virtual space, because we can support other people to change from being perhaps pessimistic, to change from perhaps thinking they don't have very much control over things, into optimists. It's really easy to help people to feel that they are in control. And we know what happens when people feel optimistic or feel in control or feel resilient. They have better grades, better jobs, better friendships, they get sick less often, and they live 8 years longer. So why wouldn't we want to do this? So cognitive behavioral psychology tells us this, and this is critical. And I would say, if you take anything away from the day, speakers always say, please take this away. Cognitive behavioral psychology tells us our thoughts determine our feelings. Our feelings affect our speech. Our speech affects our behavior. If someone says to you, can't be bothered, look at their behavior that follows. And that behavior affects their physiology, because they slump down on the chair, don't they? CBP tells us our thoughts determine our feelings affect our speech determines our behavior determines our physiology. That's why pessimists die 8 years older, 8 years earlier, because their physiology is not great. That's why they get sick. CBP tells us all these things linked, and if we change any one of them, we change them all. Changing somebody's thoughts, really difficult. Changing somebody's feelings, really difficult. Changing somebody's speech, really easy. But if you're going to change somebody's speech, you've got to be their person. And those of you who work in mental health or social services, you know that we talk a lot about the therapeutic alliance, which is kind of a theoretical posh term meaning a relationship. And this is the critical thing. If we go into work each day and, I know what I'm doing and I've read all the books and I know what to do and blah, 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 but I'm not actually there for the person, if I'm not really listening to if I'm not really actively listening to them, if I'm not actually respecting them, I'm not their person. I won't get a therapeutic alliance with them. I will not develop a relationship with them. And I can tell them whatever I like. I can have whatever conversations I can manage to squeeze out of them, but they won't change. If, on the other hand, I can develop that alliance, that relationship, now I've got the potential really to support that person. So everybody will have heard of this. Carl Rogers' person-centered approaches. So, person-centered therapy, child-centered therapy, family-centered therapy. And it depends on these 3 things. And I think, I hope many of you would agree, I'm sure you do, these 3 things are essential to developing a therapeutic relationship, or a positive relationship, let's call it. And I think if you exhibit those 3 things, you can build a relationship. And if any one of them is missing, it's not going to happen. You can go into work every day being a EMDR therapist. It's not going to happen. You can be a DBT therapist. It's not going to happen. You can be a mentor or a coach. It's not going to happen if there is no relationship underneath it. And I think what you've got to do is what Rogers says, and you've got to deploy, display, exhibit, embody these 3 things. Empathy, not sympathy. Oh, I'm so sorry. No, don't need that. Empathy. I can totally understand what it's like for you. This must be really difficult. I'm telling you that I understand your position. Congruence, which means that when I say this to you, or when I say anything to you, what I do is with every aspect of my being, all of my paralinguistics, my eye contact, my facial expressions, and all of that, I embody what I'm saying in words. And we all know, don't we, when people, say things like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that you've been unwell, and they say it like that, and you think, no, you're not. We can tell. And actually, we know from research that it takes a microsecond for somebody to know whether or not you're being, if you like, genuine, if you're being congruent. So if you're not empathic and you're not congruent, you can pretty much forget a relationship. If you've pretty much forgotten a relationship, your work isn't going to happen. And the third one, UPR, and we all know about this, unconditional positive regard. You may have done something absolutely dreadful. I will tell you that the dreadful thing you've done was a dreadful thing, but I will never ever tell you that you are dreadful. So I think if we employ those three things, A, we've got the potential to make relationship with somebody. And I think what that means is we've got the potential to help them to learn to be optimistic, or if you like, resilient. And these are things that people say to us, children, young people say these kinds of things all the time. Oh, I can't do anything right. I'm no good. It's just no point. I don't care. I'm not, it's boring. They say these things all the time. And what they're doing, their explanatory style, is they're saying, actually, can you please help me? Because I'm unhappy. I feel that I've got no control. I feel that nobody's interested in me. And that way lies pessimism and all the negative things that apply to that. And I think there are some really useful things that we can say to people which are empathic and not sympathetic and not cross. And they're these kinds of things. And in my own work, and I've done lots of coaching and mentoring and counselling and things over the years, don't do it now. I think that probably the thing that I said most, which helped unpack people's thoughts and feelings and emotions, was when they said any of those things. I can't be bothered, nobody likes me. What's the point? I'm only going to end up failing again. And I would say to them, and I'm being congruent when I say this. So when I say it, my face says it, like I'm really puzzled. Why do you say that? Why do you think that? And I think if you employ all of that congruence and the person knows that you're actually putting yourself in their shoes, there is a possibility that they will relate to you. And then there's a possibility that actually they will pick stuff up from you and possibly start talking differently because you've helped them to unpack their issue. Why do you say that? Oh, nobody likes me. Well, you're telling me nobody likes you. Well, my nan likes me. Okay, so why does your nan like you? Because I do things for her. Okay, is there anybody else you do things for? Well, the woman down the shop sometimes. So actually, you just said that nobody likes you, but now you're telling me that two people like you. So tell you what, let's make a list of all the people that like you. You help the person to unpack that particular onion, take it off layer by layer, and see actually, there are positives going on in their lives. So in the time I have available, and I did that deliberately to mean, depending upon where I was in the presentation, did I mean, we've got 5 minutes left, so in the time I have available, blah, blah. Or actually what I meant was, I'm a caseworker, and I've got half an hour with somebody. In the time I have, or I'm an arresting police officer, and I've got, I don't know how long that takes, 5 minutes or something, to put them in the back of the car, drive them to the police station. Or if I'm somebody who's, in a more long-term transaction with somebody. So in whatever time you've got available, can you be someone's person? How would you do that? And if you manage it, what will you achieve? And I could have put here, I didn't, but so I'm going to say it now. What will you achieve for yourself and for them? And actually, what will it take from me? And now I'm reading that, I'm thinking, well, that's a funny one. I don't mean what will it take out for me, like at the end of the day, I'm going to be exhausted. You probably will be. We probably all are anyway, aren't we? But what will it take? Have I got to change any of my attitudes or beliefs? Have I got to look at this young person and think, you're blooming scallywag? Or have I got to think, hang on, do you know why he's presenting to me like this? because my society has damaged him. We've taken his life opportunities away. We've put so many barriers in his path. His grandparents failed in the education system and the care system and the justice system. His parents failed in the care system and the justice system and the education system. And guess what, Wayne? You're going to fail in it too. In fact, you're here today because you've already failed. And you're only 16 because you're a failure. Or are we going to think, this young person is here because I'm the last chance saloon now? So many people have failed him. I am not going to fail this person. So I don't know how long we've got left, but perhaps in a minute we might talk about that. Oh, the elephant. Well, I've done the elephant, haven't I? Really? You know, are we just satisfied to say, well, okay, you know, worked with that young person, and you know what, they're a bit better. That's great. I've been really effective. Next, next, next. Or are we going to say, hang on a minute, while these people are in the queue, of course I will deal with them. Of course I will support them. Of course I will do my utmost to be their person. But actually, why are there more and more and more people joining this queue? What's happening? I think we're there. I'm going to get rid of that. Zoe, I'm going to let you
Nick,
say something while I have a breather.
well, you have a breather. Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking as usual. Two things occurred to me during the presentation. I put one of them in the chat, but I think our police officer has had to go off and be a police officer. But it was picking up on the on your chart with the vulnerability and the well and the illness. One of something interesting that I think is being undertaken locally, but by police, is a shift to looking at vulnerable people and children rather than traumatized children and adults. So I think that that's quite a key message there. You know, so we can get into terminology, can't we? And you know, this means this, but actually, if we think about people being vulnerable, that's slightly different. So a change in perspective there. The other thing, Nick, as you were talking about how can I be that person? I was thinking about our conversation last week and your very interesting bit of research, really, or data, I don't know what you call it, you know, concerning your children in care a few years ago. I don't know if you want to just say about that, because I think it's a really interesting perspective. And I'm going to say it as well. If people go away with one thing today, I want it to be that.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, so I was saying to Zoe in a conversation earlier that in a past life I had been advising a couple of London boroughs about, you know, provision for children and young people looked after. And one of the things that we did was for a whole group of people who were coming up to the end of their period, so that they were 16 to 21, or nearly 21, but the 20-year-olds were about to go out of the system and, you know, have no more support at all. So we invited about 300 children and young people looked after to a meeting. We gave them Tesco tokens and, you know, phone cards and stuff like that. And about half of them came and half of them didn't. And we said to the half that came, and there was a really great atmosphere in there. We've been talking, but, you know, no rubbish going on. We were just talking to them. And I said, so, you know, why do you think it is that half of you have turned up and half of you haven't? And a couple of people said, well, you know, the other people are out, you know, dealing, or they're busy being exploited, or, you know, they couldn't be asked, or, you know, whatever it happened to be. And I said, so why are you different? They said, because we don't want our children to have the same experiences that we've had. I said, okay, so, but, you know, I just want to dig a bit deeper here. What's happened to you to change your mind, to make you so determined that, and one of them made me laugh. She said to me, do you know what I want? She said, when I grow up, I want to have 3 children. I want to own a cake shop. I always remember that. Anyway, so I said to them, so what's you know, what's changed your attitude to things? And they said, all of them, every single one of them said, a person has changed me. So I said, okay, this is really interesting. Do you mind telling me who the person was? This is who the person was in reverse order. 1, a TA at school or a caseworker. 2, a teacher. And in top place, the most influential person to change somebody's entire attitude to themselves and therefore to life was Granddad, Grandpa. So Zoe, I know, she said to me the other day, if you forget to say this, I'm going to ask everybody. So I'm queuing you in now, Zoe, so that you can say what needs to be taken away. Go on, go for it.
What needs to be taken away from today, and thinking about my notion this morning of the unprofessional professional. How are you going to be grandpa? How are you going to have that meaningful relationship? And, you know, grandpas come in all shapes and sizes, and they have lots of time, or they might only have a little bit of face-to-face time, or they might have, you know, they might live hundreds of miles away, or they might live up the road. Just for me, just as you're going about your practice, how are you going to be grandpa?
Yeah, and I think that if we can do that for one person each, there's a thing called a critical mass, isn't there? You know, when we get to the critical mass, when we have each supported somebody to become themselves, to see their own potential and to start realizing even just a tiny bit of it, once we've got a critical mass of people doing that, you know, that elephant, I think it goes back where it should be. And I think somebody up above us will start thinking, you know, what we need to do is stop people being vulnerable. Let's change schools. Let's change the justice system. Let's change the social care system so that we actually do what we're supposed to do in the social contract. You know, we elect governments, and there is a thing, it's unspoken, unwritten, it's called a social contract. We elect them on the basis that we give them the jobs and they look after us. They don't look after us. I'm not talking Conservatives and Labour Party. I'm saying that when people get out into positions in the macro system, they forget about the individuals. That's what we need to do. If we can get to critical mass by each of us affecting 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 people, and those people going back to their families and affecting their families, and those families going back to their communities and affecting their communities, we'll get to a critical mass and things will change. And we'll have a queue, but there won't be more and more and more people joining it. And one day we'll say, next, and there will be no one there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Just one comment from Emily there. She says that she thinks what you're saying about resilience is interesting. Most of us will never have to face the stress, trauma and adversity for some of those that we're working with. And we may have a higher level of perceived resilience and optimism. Putting a label of not resilient on people is unhelpful. And I think you're absolutely right, Emily. There is a question here. I agree with your thoughts on the macro system, but how do we change this given the emphasis placed currently of possession and self and the MSN influence?
Well, it's really difficult because, you know, I think what we've got to do is we've got to say, hey, look, I've got some influence. Maybe I've only got influence in this room, but I'm working with a child or a young person. And if I can, I want to reach out to their family. And I want to spread these, you know, optimistic, resilient ideas also into families, because perhaps in doing that, I can help spread that into a community. And perhaps then that family and that community, maybe through a school, which would be a great thing, can start saying to Ofsted when they're rocking, hang on a minute, you know, this is why we've got all these children on pupil premium. Because actually, you're not really doing your job right, are you? Because what you do when you rock into my school and start grading us as outstanding or needs improvement, whatever, is you're not looking at what we're actually doing. You're not looking at the children and young people that we've got here, and you're not really looking at their needs. What you're doing is you're doing a tick box exercise. So, okay, I understand you've got to do that. You've got to do it, so do it. But when you go back to where you came from, can you please have a discussion with people and say, unless you want to come back to this school and 1,000 schools like it in X years' time, you're going to find exactly the same things until somebody who's got some influence in the macro system changes things. Listen, if I said to you, Black Lives Matter, we have got power if we express our voice as a large enough group. So while we think my job is to deal with people on a day-to-day basis, that's wonderful. We are dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully we're enhancing their lives, their life experiences. But actually, if we really want to be influential, what we've got to do is to try in whatever way we can to shift the system, to have this conversation with more and more and more people, so that eventually somebody says, this is not good enough, we want more. We want better. Talk about it in your setting. Talk about it to your team. Talk about it in your school. Talk about it in your local authority, wherever, and say, hang on, how do we deal with this? How do we stop it happening?